This month, Australia took to the polls in the country's first referendum in 24 years. The public voted to reject the proposal, which aimed to establish a formal body for Australia's Indigenous people to give advice on laws, a voice.
I want to say that while tonight's result is not one that I had hoped for, I absolutely respect the decision of the Australian people and the democratic process that has delivered it.
Labour Prime Minister Anthony Albanese addressed Australians after a gut-wrenching defeat for his government. The public debate leading up to polling day was visceral and highly divisive.
If you don't know, vote no! Once more, if you don't know, vote no!
We must, as a collective, say goodbye to reconciliation and usher in an era of reckoning.
I don't want to hear more crumbs discussions anymore. I don't want to hear more advisories. I want to see real change for my people. That's all I want to see.
But beyond political controversies, the campaign became a lightning rod for extreme conspiracy theorists.
It's about them establishing another corporation so they can continue to control and run this country. The lands need to come back to the sovereigns.
Next on the agenda is reparations and tenancy rent. You've been warned and you will pay if you don't remain vigilant.
I'm Beth Godwin, joined by reporter Jackie Wakefield, and this is BBC Trending. In this series, we're investigating how social media is shaping extreme behaviour and beliefs on the fringes of the internet, and in some cases, bringing it into the mainstream. Earlier in the series, we explored the growing online community who doubt the existence of germs. But in this episode, we're investigating how harmful conspiracy theories have proliferated on social media around Australia's Voice to Parliament referendum. You may be wondering, how did this referendum come about in the first place? Jackie, the BBC's global disinformation reporter and Aussie, is here to explain. Jackie, how did this come to be?
So Australian First Nations people have faced generations of discrimination and disadvantage, and many experts say this is a direct legacy of colonisation in Australia. First Nations Aussies have worse health and educational outcomes, and they're proportionally the most incarcerated racial group on the planet. Advisory bodies have been created over the years to address these disparities, but they're often handpicked by the Prime Minister at the time. They're not always representative of Indigenous communities, and they're usually dissolved with changes of leadership, meaning a lot of the recommendations they do make don't end up happening, or they're not embraced by the Indigenous community as a whole.
And how was the Voice proposed?
The idea for the Voice came from a petition from First Nations people to all Australians called the Uluru Statement from the Heart. Shared in 2017, the statement calls for substantive reform to help realise Indigenous rights through the establishment of an Indigenous Voice to Parliament and a commission which would undertake processes of agreement-making, or a treaty, and truth-telling. I spoke to Bridget Kammer, an Indigenous woman and co-chair of the Uluru Youth Dialogue, who was involved in this statement's creation.
So the Voice comes from First Nations people. It is the first call to action in the Uluru Statement from the Heart, which was issued to the Australian people on the 26th of May 2017. But to get to that point, there was actually a lot of work that happened, particularly through the regional dialogue process, which was a consultation process where over 1,200 First Nations people were consulted. The key question that they were asked to answer was, what does constitutional recognition mean to you? They said that if we are going to constitutionally recognise us, go to a referendum and ask the Australian people, we want it to change our lives positively.
What were the Australian people asked, and what were the main positions of the campaigns?
The question asked of the Australian people was whether the Constitution should recognise the First Peoples of Australia by establishing an Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander voice. They had to either answer yes or no. Those campaigning for a yes vote focused on respect and recognition. However, the no camp is largely split. You have the criticism coming from some First Nations communities that it isn't enough, they haven't been consulted enough, and they want a treaty first. Then you had the official no campaign, primarily funded by a conservative lobby group. They said the Voice to Parliament would have been divisive. They said it would promote opportunity for High Court challenges, which is disputed by experts, and they wanted to know the specific legislation before the vote. There was also a side of the debate which played on stereotypes and put out disinformation which was harmful to First Nations people, and was often associated with those against The Voice. Australians unequivocally rejected The Voice, with roughly 60% of Aussies voting no.
The campaigns for and against The Voice officially started in February, 8 months before the polls opened. And almost immediately, the online debate was flooded with disinformation, including false claims about the rules of the referendum, the Constitution, and key campaign figures.
We knew from before the referendum campaign even began that this was going to be really susceptible to disinformation. What we've found, as we'd feared, is that the volume of disinformation is astronomically high. And it's also been very influential in people's opinion forming and very influential in the mainstream narratives around the referendum.
That's Ed Coper, CEO of communications agency Popularis. He's been researching the online discourse around the referendum and beyond. He says that Australia's sovereign citizens have been particularly interested in the referendum online. Sovereign citizen ideologies emerged in the United States in the 70s. The general idea is based on the belief that an illegitimate government has slowly and secretly taken over. For this reason, they believe that even though they physically reside in a country, they are separate or sovereign from its government. In practice, many sovereign citizens think they do not have to pay tax, adhere to court orders, or follow any laws. Terry Nichols is perhaps the best-known believer in sovereign citizen ideas. He filed endless frivolous lawsuits against the US government before perpetrating the infamous 1995 Oklahoma City bombing, which killed 168 people. In Australia, there have been cases where so-called sovereigns have violently confronted the police.
The sovereign citizen movement really flocked to any kind of issue about the legitimacy of the institutions of governance and democracy. And what is a referendum? You're talking about changing one of those instruments, which happens very rarely.
I asked Ed about how these groups spread false information online during the lead up to the referendum.
There's been all sorts of techniques and tactics of disinformation, and some of it's just been about, picking an outlandish lie and spreading it. Some of it's been about doctoring imagery to make it appear to be something else. But some of the extreme examples really are around the methods of spreading this sort of content. So there was one post that we discovered that had 53,000 shares on Facebook, and it was a doctored piece of Aboriginal art by an artist that actually supports The Voice to look like it was saying vote no.
Jackie actually tracked down this artist.
I do a lot of public art throughout Sydney and all around the suburbs. I do get commissions from building companies to do their public art in their new buildings. And I'm also a cartoonist for the National Aboriginal newspaper.
Danny Eastwood is an award-winning First Nations artist and elder of the Ngamba tribe. He's been creating art for decades. In 2018, he painted Uluru, previously named Ayers Rock. It's a painting in the traditional Indigenous dot art style, showing the Aboriginal sun over the warm red rock of Uluru, with kangaroos bounding in the foreground. He created it in homage to the sacred Aboriginal site.
Specialist doctor rang me up and asked me, do I know they're using my art? He emailed me and sent all the details and showed me pictures. And I downloaded, and it was such a far right-wing neo-Nazi type group who was printing it, saying horrible things about Aboriginals. It totally disgusted me.
The painting was used without permission by a far-right conspiracy theorist with beliefs in line with the sovereign citizens, who produced it on a flyer which falsely claimed The Voice would mean reparations and used degrading language about Aboriginal people. And Danny felt these people were claiming him as supporting their side.
They're using my art, and everyone knows my art and what it is. Any Aboriginal has seen it, say, oh, Danny's a no-voter. So that's why they sold that particular piece of art.
The conspiracy theorist claimed they distributed over 20,000 flyers with a doctored image, but it doesn't stop there. Online, I've seen the artwork used as a symbol for sovereign citizens and in posts from neo-Nazi accounts, accompanied with racist conspiracies and false information. It's not an isolated case. Throughout the campaign, other First Nations people saw their words twisted and their videos targeted by the extremes of the debate. Reporter Damien Williams was one of them. he went into remote communities asking people what they knew about the Voice to Parliament. Here, they're asking a First Nations elder in the local language, Arrernte. The elders say they don't know much about the Voice, but someone on TikTok cut the interview off here and added this commentary.
The Voice is supposed to help Indigenous communities. So why do they know nothing about it?
But what the TikToker doesn't show you is that at the end of the original clip, Damien explains the Voice, and the elders are all in support of the idea. When looking at other content on this person's TikTok page, it's full of sovereign citizen theories that Australia is a corporation and the Voice is a scheme to bring about a UN takeover. Bridget told me she was understandably concerned by this type of content.
I think it's really disappointing that people, particularly with platform, have used their social media accounts to continue to create that confusion, continue to pump out lies and use First Nations voices to do that and take that out of context. I think it's being used maliciously against First Nations people and playing into that rhetoric that, oh, if First Nations people all can't agree between themselves, then what hope have we got? And why should we support this?
Some experts agree that sovereign citizens are purposely co-opting First Nations voices for their cause. It's easy to understand why this tactic is so successful.
I think if you have an Indigenous person making these claims for people of good faith or of good heart who might be more inclined to listen and think, oh, I want to hear Aboriginal voices, if you have an Indigenous person saying these sovereign citizen-inflected arguments, I think that does give it more legitimacy.
Harry Hobbs is an associate professor at the University of Technology, Sydney. He researches Indigenous constitutional reform and sovereignty. He told me that these sovereign citizen arguments, often associated with the far-right and neo-Nazi movements, have been gaining supporters from within the Indigenous community too. In 2010, Mark McMurtry, who claims Indigenous heritage, set up a group called the Original Sovereign Tribal Federation. The group is made up of people from First Nations heritage, or those who claim to be, some of whom are heavily influenced by sovereign citizen ideas. They say they want to stand down the illegal corporation harming us all, in reference to the Australian government, which of course isn't a corporation. In late 2021, some other members of the Original Sovereign Tribal Federation group set fire to Australia's old Parliament House, and they attempted to take over the Aboriginal Tent Embassy. The embassy is a continuous protest for Indigenous land rights that's been stationed in Canberra for over 50 years. Their idea of sovereignty and land rights has a legal basis and is much more coherent than the original sovereigns, whose conspiracy theories claim Australia is a corporation and they're preparing for a UN takeover. Jackie explains what happened that day.
In mid-December 2021, people from the Original Sovereign Tribal Federation set up a camp called Makata, near the Aboriginal Tent Embassy. As the month went on, tensions between the Makata camp and the Aboriginal Tent Embassy grew. As the days passed, more sovereign citizens showed up who weren't from Aboriginal backgrounds, using this opportunity to protest the Australian corporation. It's unclear how intertwined the original sovereigns are with the sovereign citizens in Australia. However, both were at the protest and both had a similar message. Then, it all came to a head when Makata said they were conducting a traditional smoking ceremony under the entrance of the old Parliament House, which set fire to its doors. After a violent clash with the police outside of the building 2 weeks after the fire, officers dismantled the Makata camp. The Sydney Morning Herald reported that when police forcibly moved the group, they responded with QAnon-style phrases, such as pedophile protectors. The Aboriginal Tent Embassy protest members condemned the Makata group, saying it was an attempt by the original sovereign movement to co-opt the First Nations sovereignty rights movement, and bore no similarity to their fight for sovereignty.
Harry says the original sovereigns twisted the notion of First Nations sovereignty.
They were there creating a real big menace for the original people who are holding the Tent Embassy and trying to maintain it as a symbol of sovereignty. And also really, I suppose, trying to just confusing non-Indigenous Australians about the whole idea of what this is and making them question whether the Aboriginal Tent Embassy should be there at all.
One of the women who was in the Makata camp was Cindy Roberts.
Don't with us. There's the old Parliament House up in flames, everybody.
Before she became involved in the movement, she was a prominent Indigenous activist, speaking out about the lack of Indigenous education in the school curricula and violence against women. Looking at her social media and public appearances, she began to speak about the sovereign citizen rhetoric during the pandemic, and she turned her focus to the Voice referendum during the campaign.
We are not the enemy. This corporation, the Crown, the Australian corporate government, that's your enemy.
That was from her most viral video, a statement full of false sovereign citizen rhetoric. The video has been taken down by some social media sites, but pops up on other accounts. At the time of recording, one version on TikTok had over 640,000 views. Cindy wasn't just getting views on social media, though. She was featured as a no voter across mainstream Australian broadcast outlets. And she's not alone. Other First Nations people spoke publicly with similar conspiracy rhetoric throughout the campaign. Anthony Mundine, a famous Indigenous boxer, made videos with Cindy, who you can hear in the background of this Instagram video.
We don't want to be included because if we're included, then it's the New World Order takeover's on. It's over.
And he has been featured by the official No campaign and on this segment on Sky News.
Basically, it's a takeover. They want to take our sovereignty, so we fall under their jurisdiction as British subjects. So once our sovereignty is ceded, then we will have no power.
His statements have no basis in fact. Experts like Harry are concerned over the spreading of these pseudo-legal narratives amongst genuine Indigenous activists.
Well, there's a really big uptick in this intersection between sovereign citizens and Indigenous activists. If you have an Indigenous person saying these sovereign citizen-inflected arguments, I think that does give it more legitimacy. I think that's a key benefit of what the sovereign citizen movement is seeing. I think they're doing this on purpose in many respects. They're trying to appropriate this language, one, to try to latch on to the moral or the political strength that Indigenous claims do have, even if they have no legal right in Australia or any legal cachet as such. They have a lot of moral and political cachet in a lot of communities and a lot of societies.
We asked Bridget why the sovereign citizen narrative is growing in influence amongst Indigenous people.
Yeah, I think there's always a risk, and our people do have distrust with the government, which is, totally legitimate because of what we've experienced as First Peoples of this nation.
We asked Cindy Roberts why she was spreading these false narratives and attempting to take over the Aboriginal Tent Embassy.
She declined to comment on the Aboriginal Tent Embassy. She said she does not speak to foreign media or interfere in foreign affairs. She implied the BBC wasn't qualified to comment on the issue of conditions of the sovereignty of her people. She said the BBC's and the UN's depiction of sovereignty is of no lawful consequence to her, and that the Widjabul sovereign nation has reason to protect its national sovereignty from all interference.
And Anthony Mundine didn't reply to our request for comment. Before the vote, Australian Prime Minister Albanese expressed his concern about the disinformation that was marring the debate.
There has been a lot of disinformation out there. There is worse information in some social media as well about the world conspiracies of the United Nations will control all land in Australia.
People posting sovereign citizen conspiracies only played a small role in the disinformation surrounding the campaign. But Harry thinks the referendum has catalysed the spread of their pseudo-legal claims and racism.
The sovereign citizen-inflected Indigenous claims has really been spread by wildfire by the referendum. Well, the referendum has really catalysed this. When I talk to Aboriginal friends who are older than me who have seen this before, they say they haven't seen this level of racism since they were in high school. What's sort of been pumping into the social media sphere. A lot of that is misinformation, obviously, but a lot of it is then inflected with this sovereign citizen style stuff because it just spreads through TikTok and Facebook and other things.
According to the RMIT Fact Check and Associate Australian Press Fact Check, the disinformation from the no side was overwhelming compared to the yes side. The main criticism of the yes side was that they weren't detailed enough in what they were proposing, rather than false claims. Ed Coper thinks what he terms the brutally effective disinformation campaign from the no side was a terminal mix for the yes campaign, and a key reason support for the Voice dropped in pre-referendum polls from 65% to be as low as 35% in a very short time.
It's difficult to tell how much impact the wider false claims online had on the result, and we may never know. But Ed thinks it played a significant role.
This is just the power of disinformation to impact things in society. in a really meaningful sense. A lot of people just think of it as, wacky fringe theories. These are really serious issues that are eroding a lot of things that are important.
Bridget remains hopeful about the future and strength of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people.
First Nations people are really resilient. We're very strong, and we've had to be, because otherwise we still wouldn't be here 200 odd years later after everything we've endured.
That's it for this episode of BBC Trending's Extreme series. A huge thanks to reporter Jackie Wakefield, our editor Flora Carmichael, and Hal Haynes, who mixed this programme. If you want to get in touch about this episode, then you can do so by emailing me at beth.godwin@bbc.co.uk. We're also on Facebook and Twitter. Just search for BBC Trending and follow us. And remember to leave us a rating or review wherever you get your podcasts from.